Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Security Noise, SOC Market Trends. I'm your host, Geoff Walton, and I lead our application security team at TrustedSec. Today we'll be discussing what the cutting edge of SOC operations should look like, the tools, the tasks, the people, the policy. We've got Carlos Perez and Zach Bevilacqua with us on the show. They're here to give us some expert insight into both the training and building of effective teams, as well as the execution of incident response. I'm also here with my producer, Skyler Tudor, who is going to make the show sound great and contribute his thoughts as well. I guess I'll go ahead and let Carlos and Zach introduce themselves. Carlos, welcome back to the show. How have you been?
Thank you. Been good. This has been a very busy year of many business email compromises and a couple of ransomware cases on the IR side.
And Zach, it looks like you have a blog at least in the works. You want to tell us a little bit about what that will be and what people can expect?
Yeah. So blog's still in the review process, but it's going to be titled, I got 99 logs, or I got 99 problems, but a log isn't one. So that's just basically going back to basic logging, a lot of things that are sometimes glazed over even today after a lot of time, and then just kind of coming up with the basics, why it's important, and the coverage that you can get by just making sure that you're collecting those things.
And I didn't have any, but I will go ahead and put Carlos maybe on the spot. Do you have any InfoSec ICMIs for the week, Carlos?
I would say so far, it's been interesting, a couple of cases where we've seen several customers and several ransomware groups and access brokers using the same technique of flooding your environment with subscriptions and then calling you over Teams to then get you to use Quick Assist. So that seems to have become a very common technique. In fact, Caroline from the IR team actually posted a blog post on Quick Assist and how it has been abused lately.
Okay, well, Quick Assist. And you can check out Caroline's blog at trustedsec.com, I'm sure, for a little bit more information on that. Mm-hmm. But we should jump right into things. I think everybody has some idea of what a security operations center looks like. Even if you're not directly familiar with it, you've probably seen it on TV. For a large organization or service provider, it's going to look a lot like that, but maybe with some fewer exciting animations. For smaller organizations, it could be a couple of people that start their day reviewing logs from last night's SIEM events. Maybe just a simple web client or something while they attend to other duties. With that in mind, maybe we should start with, what's new in terms of recent trends and anything folks might not have encountered yet. Carlos, Zach?
I would say one thing that keeps popping up when we're working a couple of cases, especially with those that have a SOC, is the deconfliction side. Many times we have heard, we think this might be a pen test, but we're not sure, which shows a bit of lack of communication or coordination between the SOC and other parts of the teams across the infrastructure. So that's one that I still find surprising nowadays. That comes up quite often.
Because generally the Security Operations Center, they're like the one team that's generally informed when a penetration test is being performed, because you don't want to inform other people if it's going to be a live detection exercise.
When we get that call and then, we have all of this data, but we're not sure. It looks like a pen test. We're not sure it's a pen test. And I'm going like, shouldn't you guys know ahead of time when a pen test actually is coming your way?
Or have a list of firms that you're working with and then double check with them, against the IPs that you're detecting?
Seems like there almost ought to be, one of those boxes on the wall with a slit cut in the top of it and a padlock on it. So somebody can, walk in at the beginning of the week and just put a note about the pen test that's supposed to be happening. And if anybody in the SOC thinks there's a pen test, they could run over and open the box and find out for sure.
Yeah.
That's a way.
You can still have the best of both worlds as far as, no notice, but yet, I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah.
Probably not a really good thought.
And I still see them struggle quite a bit when it comes to tuning their SIMs. Like this is something that even Zach and I have spoken before, where proper data sources are not being ingested, or as I was working a case that had quite a large SOC and everything, I was trying to get, for example, all of the 4688s. Process was created from one host, and the query was taking like almost 4 hours to get all of the process creates for one specific day. So it was actually faster just for me to just connect via the EDR, drop Velociraptor, run Velociraptor, copy out the output, bring it over, and then process it on my own machine. And the SIM was still running, trying to process that information.
And that's a good point, right? Not even, it's about as a detrimental to the SOC to not collect the right events as it is to collect too many events, right, you start to performance issues, as you just said. But also, if you're sifting through that much data when you're starting a vague, broad search, then there's too much to sift through and you're going to get fatigued. Your SOC members will be fatigued searching through that data. Or it takes so long to get that data back, you're wasting your time to contain that event.
Well, and that kind of brings us to what a lot of SIEM tools were supposed to be doing, hopefully, was triaging a lot of that data as it came in and either generating a smaller pool of events to search or exactly that, or at least being able to quickly associate the logs behind those events for retrieval. Have we seen a lot of advancements as far as AI technology, since that seems to be what is the current buzz in the market? I mean, certainly in terms of SIEM tools and log aggregations, machine learning isn't new, but I imagine, are we actually seeing some new tools based on generative AI and that kind of machine learning, tensor, things like that? Or is it all just buzzwords on the products that we've had for 10 years?
I have one customer that actually had it enabled for Sentinel. So they had the Copilot or whatever it is enabled in the cloud specifically for Sentinel. He was demoing it for me, and he was using it to search logs, like give me all of the specific cases for lateral movement that involve WMIC, this, and this for this specific host. And he was doing quite some nice prompt engineering, and it was bringing some data, but then we ran other tests in the environment or the queries. And after we ran those, one of the things that I noticed was that the AI was actually hallucinating. So the AI was mentioning stuff that was not there in the logs, or in other cases, it was bringing me information that it was missing data. Like, one of them was, I see WEV util running in the environment. I see this other part running. I see task manager. And then I'm also seeing MSI exec. And it's running under the same context from the same AnyDesk session. I'm going like, why is it not showing AnyDesk? And he's going like, I don't know. I did tell it to show me all RMM tools, and go like, but it's there. So it does help, but I don't trust it still 100% or not even 90%. Still has hallucinations showing stuff that wasn't there. Like there's WMIC, but I couldn't see WMIC running anywhere. And then I look at the Defender for endpoint, and there was no WMI traffic, but it was telling me that there was WMIC. And then, so yeah, it's hit and miss still, I think.
I wonder how that integration worked, that it would be hallucinating like that instead of identifying specific lines. I would have thought that would have been a tool call event to actually like locate the lines with basically a grep, and the LLM would just be generating the search parameters. But interesting.
It has hallucinations. It's what I think it's what it's called.
Yeah. And you have to be careful, right? With AI, especially generative AI, they're just generating patterns based on likelihood of the next thing coming up, right? So you have to be careful, with an LLM, it's doing that same thing with words, right? These set of words come next after these words have happened. And that's how you're getting that natural language processing. Also, with snapping those tools into the SOC, you have to be really careful, because if you're going to try and complete the investigation process with AI, you're going to get a set of patterned response. So the hallucination would be, I expect that to be here when I'm looking in this investigation, so I'll place it in, right? That's what the AI is saying. Mm-hmm. And you're going to get that stuff back, and without actually checking it, right, it could be wrong. Just like when you're dealing with any AI, right? That AI could be wrong, but you have to know enough to be able to call out the AI when it's making those determinations or rules responses. So if you're not just using it as an augmentation to fill in text after it has reached out to grab hard data, right, with those calls, as you said, it gets to, I don't want to say dangerous, but right, it could make the wrong determination if you don't have that human part of the determination process. So
yeah,
it can help, but it could also hurt.
I can imagine that happens, because I've been experimenting with some tool call stuff, and especially with the Llama 3 API, and it will do the tool call. It will actually pull back lines from a file or something like that, and then it will give them to you. And if your application displays the tool call outlet, you're going to be fine. If you then feed that tool call back to the model, that's when it'll do some really interesting hallucinating. So that whole conversation level there, I would think think would be something that, at least in the SOC world and in the forensics world, they would not be using just yet. But I guess they've gone to that next layer and taken the chances, which is...
But for creating KQL, it's awesome.
I bet.
I do have to say that. Like I'll go like, I need a query for this field, this field, this field. And I give it a sample of the fields and data in CSV format. Make me a KQL query with a function that compares this time and gives me then an additional field so I can get the time of session, counting the RDP, start, disconnects, and all in between. And it worked awesome. It worked beautifully to give me that KQL with the functions. Now having to process the data, I'd rather you just generate me code too. Then I can leverage.
Well, since you mentioned KQL, I guess that is another question I had. How has the SIEM and SOC world adapted to the cloud? I mean, obviously, KQL has been out there. If you use the native workbooks and stuff in Sentinel and stuff like that, you're fine. But what if you're using, more traditional tools, older tools, your logarithms, your QRadars, things like that? Have those things kept up with the cloud? And yes, okay.
Yeah. For example, QRadar, one of the things that I saw was that it was acquired and now it is cloud-based. I hate QRadar on-prem because of the Java and the amount of resources and tuning that it takes. Every time I go into a case and they had QRadar on-prem, I go like, oh no. A little piece of me died every time I had to deal with it. Now that they're cloud and you can even use KQL and QRadar, it's not that bad. I've seen a lot of people actually move to small consultancies and even some medium ones actually use Azure Data Explorer for processing large amounts of logs. So they'll upload all of that data into Azure Data Explorer into tables, and then they'll use KQL to process all those large amounts of information. I've seen people use that for example, MFTs. So they'll upload into a Azure blob the 1 gig MFT parse out of Zimmerman tool, and then they'll just start doing KQL queries because it's a lot faster than trying to load 1 gig into Excel. And it works beautifully, works very well. But at the same time, I find they're interesting that then customers will tell us, we don't want any of our data in the cloud, but everything that we're exchanging is over M365, which is in the cloud. And when we are doing the onboarding and a lot of the other stuff, a lot of stuff is actually in Azure in data blobs. So no, you cannot use cloud, but yes, we use cloud.
It's in the cloud, but we don't want it in the cloud.
Yeah.
Interesting choices. So you prefer the SIEM environment to be in the cloud at this point, generally speaking, or is it just a QRadar specific situation?
I go with whatever the customer has, given that I am IR. I'll go and I'll deal with whatever they're running. Splunk, very well configured on-prem, works beautifully. If you have the budget of a small nation state to pay for it, it works very well. QRadar, it's a matter, so I'm blaming QRadar, but let me backtrack a bit. It's more that a lot of organizations actually just decide, let's deploy a SIEM, and they don't go through the process of actually paying for training for the SIEM. So they'll go like, oh, we are spending $50,000 in a SIEM. The training is $3,000. Ooh, $3,000, that's expensive. So people don't get trained on it, and then the SIEM's not tuned. The proper data sources are not ingested. So it is more a problem of who is using the tool than the tool itself. I think most of the tools nowadays are very capable. The problem is who is setting up that tool and how they're configuring that and leveraging it.
Has the whole sizing discussion kind of resolved a little bit? I know we're focusing maybe a little too much on SIEM here than SOC, so we'll pivot back here in a minute. But I know years ago, convincing the CIO types that this is a big data application. You need considerable amount of power. You need considerable amount of I/O behind this thing. Mm-hmm. This is not, a 2U server we stick in the back rack somewhere, repurposed from retired application. That used to be a real tough sell that this was important to do and needed a real budget. Has that changed, or is that still a conversation you find that's happening at a lot of clients?
From my side, I still see, for example, we have a customer that we're working at current engagement. Their SIEM is petabytes. So it's not gigabytes, it's not terabytes, it's petabytes of data that we're performing a threat hunt through. But yeah, I still see a lot of on-prem and on cloud. In cloud, it runs better, but it is for more bigger organizations with budget and with training. I see that being used. But how about you, Zach? You deal more with SIEMs than I do.
Yeah. With the SIEM between cloud and on-prem, it's really where most of your data is. I mean, there are some organizations that says, I prefer cloud, I prefer on-prem. But if you have to ship more of your data from on-prem to your SIEM, then it makes sense that it's on-prem, right? That could get really costly to ship that data into the cloud. If your whole environment exists in the cloud, obviously a SIEM in the cloud, especially in the same cloud, is way easier to get your data into. So it makes sense strategically that your SIEM goes where your data is, and then anything that's left over, then you ship it out, right? It's definitely a cost thing in order to do that. I don't see too many customers or organizations making decisions just because the vibes of the SIEM in the cloud are better. And as you did say, Carlos, right, having it in the cloud, it's usually managed and the resources are highly available. So it runs a little bit smoother, and you can get away with not maintaining it as much as it would be if you had it on your own equipment.
Yeah. I would say if I had one recommendation to customers is, at least for your M365 and your Azure, when that is in the cloud, and those logs are big and hard to process, all of that, Jason, probably keep that in Sentinel in the cloud instead of bringing it down. And then for on-prem, as Zach mentions, make your evaluation. How much data are you generating from what data sources? I still see the problem that there's an over-reliance on EDR, and instead of a SIEM for a lot of stuff. But then when I look at the different cases that we're working on, there have been many bypasses. For example, we just recently saw Cactus Storage bring over gaming software into the customer environment for using anti-cheat to disable the EDR. And now you're completely blind. But then when we look at all of the Windows Event Auditing, that was there still, and that was still useful, but it was local, not on the SIEM for some reason. So they go like, oh no, we're not ingesting from the client. And I bet that that decision was just because of the amount of data and the amount of resources that then you would have in prem.
It's already collecting that data as well. In that blog post that we talked about earlier that I have, I do mention the reliance on the EDR. And right, the EDR, even without being a bypass for it, the EDR is logging for itself to maintain all its functions, its alerts, everything that it's needing to do for itself. So you're not going to get the perspective that you may want in your SOC, where those Windows events, those on-host events, are going to be more valuable than some of those other EDR events. It's also easier, right? The EDR is already logging it. It already has its own log repository that it's collecting it to. You usually run into a problem with retention, right? But the data is there.
And it's good data. Don't get me wrong. The EDR has good data.
Agreed.
But at the same time, like I go with the principle of one is none, two is one. So if possible, I do like at least enabling Windows auditing and ingesting all of those logs in addition to the EDR information, and also configuring the endpoints to have larger event log files so they don't rotate and we lose all of that data.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Certainly we started out with not a whole lot other than firewall logs, but today we've got NetFlow, we've got Active Directory, we've got Entra ID events, you've got local Windows events on systems, you've got EDR packages generating logs for every client. And then I have some follow-up to this with things that Skyler and I will find dear, but what are the SOC's biggest blind spots today? What are the key data sources you think everybody should have?
Firewalls and VPN concentrators, your networking devices. I still see a large gap there. Same for IoT devices that run Linux. Like I've seen a shift from attackers to just going into the Ivanti device, into the Fortinet device with custom Lua code, custom Perl code, and they set up shop there. We've seen it many times. In fact, I was surprised when I saw Akira go into a Ivanti device and actually encrypt the firewall itself. So when they put a JTAG and a serial cable, the files inside of the Ivanti appliance actually had .Akira. So they encrypted the firewall. So we've noticed that they have a shift there, but when we do the onboarding, when we do the IR cases, and we are asking customers, are you logging your firewalls? Yes, we log denies, policies of that. You log the admin interface, somebody logging into the device itself, modifications to the configuration, startups, shutdowns, reboots, the basics. No. Do you do that for your storage appliances like your silkworms or your Brocade silkworms? No. Then we had an actor actually go in. Backups are immutable. Oh, we cannot touch them. Okay, let me go into silkworm, find the LUN in the storage array, Let me delete that LUN, and now they're gone. Even though they're immutable from the backup software itself, they just went through there. I've seen our red team go and set up shop in 3D printers, set up shop on IP phones, set up shop on F5 devices, because there are way too many EDRs or controls on the desktop, and they just switch and go where they know that people are ignoring. So the funny thing is that we already saw what happened with shadow brokers. We already saw with a lot of other toolings. We have seen ransomware crews moving very, very, very aggressively with networking devices, but enterprise still playing catch up there.
It's interesting that firewall events like that aren't logged. I would think, again, just from somebody who used to do this, those were some of the most obvious SIM alerts that I would set up right away is, somebody just logged into the administrative interface on a firewall. Somebody just went to a level 15 access on a switch. That should trigger a review just because it's not something that should even be happening during the day most times in most places.
Those things can be logged if you have petabytes worth of storage.
No, it doesn't take petabytes worth of storage to log a...
Like how often do you log into the admin interface and change configuration on your firewall? Doesn't happen that often. Same thing for your Ivanti, oh God forbid, a Fortinet, or any of the other known bad that we see exploits coming out on a constant basis. Yeah. That's the main reason also why they don't patch it. Like, oh, it's so critical, we don't want to touch it, so we don't want to do changes and reboot it. So changes are very, very, very few in between.
Well, and that is, I guess, kind of, I suppose they treat it the same way they treat applications. And I mean, I know Skyler will agree that, we test applications all the time on the AppSec team. Obviously, it's what we do. But we've had for years, hey, if you guys actually see anything in your events and stuff, let us know so we can, call that out in the report. And, we've done source reviews of applications and they don't log anything. I mean, like nothing. I've been telling people, look, you should be logging failed login events. You should be logging valid login events. Anytime a session expires, you should probably generate a log. Different authentication sources. But yet, we almost never actually get notified of these alerts.
Now that raises a question for me now that you mentioned applications and what you guys are seeing. One of the areas that many times happens with a SOC is that CVE comes up, pops in the news, management comes to the SOC and goes like, are we vulnerable to this? One of the areas that I see also a blind spot is that developers run amok and they don't document all of the libraries that they're using. Because every time I go into GitHub has a specific page for malicious stuff, and the amount of malicious NPM packages, PyPy packages, and all of that stuff is gigantic. Have you ever guys seen a customer that is not a supplier of DoD have a good control of that? Because DoD actually forces their suppliers to provide SBOMs and dynamic SBOMs. But
yeah, so your more mature organizations do have effective artifact control on their internal apps. Now, anything they bought third party and installed, that probably didn't come with an SBOM. So does, this application that we bought and deployed off the shelf, does that have the vulnerable library in it? We don't know. I would say that's probably more the norm. Generally speaking, your more mature in-house software development practices, they probably have at least effective artifact control, and they could tell you if you ask the question. Now, is anybody actively tracking and monitoring that stuff? Like a CVE drops, are the developers going to let the security team know, hey, we've got this stuff deployed that we use this library and there's just a CVE drop for it? No, I don't think that's going to happen. But if from the security side goes, hey, there's a new Tomcat CVE this week, are you guys using that version anywhere? They'll be able to answer that question most of the time. From an IR perspective, how often do you see an application really being like the target of what the threat actor was going for? Or is it still that most people are focused on getting access to that file server, getting access to SharePoint, which is an application? But how frequently does somebody want to get into a given line of business application or something like that?
Not often, but we did have one case today, this year so far out of 10 BECs and 5 to 6 ransomware cases as it has gone throughout the year. So it's very rare. It's a minimum, but we saw it. It was the exploitation of a WordPress site where they were able to inject a malicious WordPress plugin. The WordPress plugin then was using JavaScript to download other components So when you look at the plugin itself, it looked normal, it looked valid, but there was this specific import from JavaScript that was importing a bunch of other malicious JavaScript. So when we look at the cache for the application, that it was containing everything that it downloaded and it was hosting memory and it saved a copy on disk as a cache. When we look at the cache, that's where we found all of the malicious code. That it was there to trick users, checking if it is the admin, it was hiding itself. And then if you were not the admin and you were met certain criteria, it would then serve you other types of pages to yourself. And that was a very hard one to actually triage, because when you're doing IR, you're not going off logs, you're going off files, and you got to inspect all of those files. So you're seeing some weird posts in the web folder, and you're seeing those posts look funny, and then you got to match that time to that path to see if you're able to identify what's going on.
Yeah, I think that would probably be very difficult to try and follow along in a log trail, right? If you were in the SOC. I'm not even sure if the initial attack would even be shown by the authentication logs that we were talking about for your apps. You might have, maybe there were some precursors. That's where I think when you're talking about expanding your logging of your applications with those authentication logs, even firewalls or any other types of devices, if you're feeding those in, then that's a good use case for user behavior analytics. And you can get those suspicious pop-ups, right, of this user did something odd, and now your SOC can focus on them and maybe do a little bit of hunting on that user. And maybe a precursor to that exploitation was a compromised account checking out that application, and they don't usually access the application. And now you can maybe kick off IR early before some damage is done.
So that's one thing that you mentioned a second ago, working on like browser extensions. So there was an article last month from the Hacker News website that was about polymorphic attacks or polymorphic extension attacks, where they clone browser extensions to steal credentials. Have you ever come across any of that where like an extension has been able to trigger some logging rule? Does that make sense?
On the IR side, no. I don't know if SAC has seen it.
Are you talking strictly browser extensions?
Right. So I believe what it was doing, it was doing credential harvesting. This may just be more of a browser
in the browser
cache type of attack, but I wasn't sure if you had come across any incidents or IR cases where it was a browser extension that was running actions on behalf of that browser, on behalf of that user.
IR, we have not. I know that as faculty for IANS, I've actually gotten a lot of questions from organizations on it, given that they have found malicious extensions in their environment, and then they're asking how to control it. And then you're limited to some brand new tooling that came out from CrowdStrike for it, so you can have a proper inventory. There's tooling from Microsoft on the vulnerability management side if you pay for it, also for Defender for Endpoint. But visibility, getting a clear inventory of all of the browser extensions in your environment, and then having a centralized entity that is telling you are known bad, these are known good. It's hard because they don't get, a lot of them don't get even CVEs. So that metric that you're using in a production environment of using CVEs is not even there.
Well, it sounds like I just gave some attackers some ideas. So sorry about that.
Good job, Scott.
Sorry, everybody.
I know that the research team actually played with injecting malicious extensions as part of post-exploitation and persistence. So I know that we actually explored it, and it's a bit difficult, but not impossible.
What I heard you say was it's totally impossible and nobody should try it.
Yeah.
All right.
So most initial footholds today, probably somewhere on the order of 2/3, and you said business email compromise earlier, Carlos, is the initial foothold. It has some sort of social engineering component associated with it. What is the security operations team doing to react to that piece of the threat landscape specifically?
On security operations, it all stems on have they been able to set a baseline of what is known good, known bad, what it is actually off in the environment. So for example, we're talking about quick assist. That has never been kind of like the initial one that they go like, oh, we have an alert for quick assist. It is that, hey, we saw something bad, we trace it down, and then the user told us that quick assist was being used. And then they go like, and they go like, oh, we didn't know that people from outside organization can connect to us via Teams and send messages and have a conversation. And we're like, it's by default from Microsoft. A lot of customers are actually surprised. The other one is Beck. I've seen Becks are also one that I've seen attackers shift the way that they do, making it even impossible for the SOC to notice something weird, because what they're doing is that they're compromising a known partner of that entity, and then they're using that known trusted entity's SharePoint as a way of hosting their lore for when they do their business email compromise attack. We've seen that happen very often. So as a SOC operator, that initial access point is going to go unnoticed, because it is often that you connect to them. They do share files for you, so everything looks kosher for you. Now, at some point, they need to start doing data harvesting and credential harvesting to then do lateral movement. And that is where I think a SOC should spend quite a bit of time, because there's always going to be a new method of getting that initial foothold. But there's always the common criteria of going after the browser so I can get credentials, or going after applications to get credentials. I'm going to then try to find all of the different shares and start connecting to them and rummaging through those. I'm going to then start trying to connect via management protocols, RDP, SSH, Telnet, to other devices in the network. And that is where all of a sudden we have this large surface of initial access techniques that then get boiled down into a series of funnels where we can focus our attention in, specifically for lateral movement. If you want to do lateral movement, it's a management protocol. It's either WMI, SMB, SSH, Telnet, RDP, and they're known. When it comes to credential harvesting, they're going to look through the files, but more than often, they're going to go after your browser. And now we see that EDRs will log when somebody's going after the browser. Windows logs when you go over to the credential manager to do DPAPI actions to decrypt. But funny enough, I see many customers actually ignore those events. They get those warnings and go like, oh no, that's normal.
Is that because they've got just so much noise from internal management tools and they don't know how to segregate it? Or, I mean, what's the explanation behind that one, usually?
I would say Zach's better at answering that one than me, because at least from my side, when I ask them, like, why did you ignore this? They climb up.
Yeah. It's definitely embarrassing when you get called out on that stuff. But usually I see SOCs ignore things when your alerts aren't tuned, right? It's a fatigue thing. Or an alert goes off often enough and it's a false positive that they'll ignore every single one, and you'll miss that one that's actually a real event. So, I mean, it could be laziness, but it usually stems from where your alerts in the SOC aren't all true, right? Your false positive rate is too high and you'll have alerts ignored, or it becomes just an automated process where you see an event that looks a certain way, then it's false positive, just close it. And that's where you see some of those misses. Going back to the discussion about social engineering, Carlos is right. It's going to be extremely difficult to detect something at that point of that initial access. The social engineering, that is actually the way to mitigate that is all about user training. Now, you can't control what they do, but if you can get them to recognize anomalies in their day-to-day business, you'll have a better chance at mitigating attempts against your organization. And speaking of anomalies, right, all your detections, it's all about anomalies. You know, what's strange in your environment? So user behavior analytics, should one of your users fall victim to that social engineering, right? That's not something to punish them about, but if you're using behavior analytics on your users, you can see when their account is doing something strange, and that means that it's under someone else's control. And you can start, your investigation there instead of, oh no, we've got lateral movement. I'd like to say, oh no, this user is trying to authenticate here the first time, and they're not supposed to do that, not when they've done it 100 times. So yeah, social engineering is very tough. You're not going to know when an external entity gets breached. And usually they're attacking you before the entity knows that anything's happened. So it is definitely a difficult situation to cut it off that early.
Has software as a service, since you mentioned external entities, is that creating a larger blind spot for organizations?
I don't know that it would be causing a blind spot. I mean, yeah, if you move more business functions outside of your control, then any number of things can go wrong at that point. And then you're vulnerable to that because they're a trusted entity. And that's the problem. Like, that's why if your target is a hardened entity, right, a hardened organization, you're going to want to go for their partners that aren't as hardened. That, and that's what keeps Carlos so busy, right?
Yes, it does.
Absolutely.
Especially, and one example of that is something as simple as M365. Either you have a life or you don't, or you have the extra license to enable, you're still an E3, but now you have the E5 login. Now we're seeing that a lot of those software as a service type platforms or platform as a service, what happens is that they'll nickel and dime you for those security features for that monitoring if you want it, which then causes super large gaps in your environment.
Well, let's jump to the other side of the compromise scenario real fast before we wrap up anyway. How about situations on the exfiltration angle of things? Because, ransomware aside and stuff like that, for a lot of times it's I want to get in, I want to get the data out, and I want to then sell the data. Should SOCs be doing more to look for big outflows, key resources being accessed externally, things of that nature?
I think they should. How much are they going to find? I'm not sure, because I'm starting to see, before we would look at the firewall logs and we would look for large amounts of data being exfiltrated from what host, and then we could kind of like target which application and everything. When the Defender for Endpoint actually keeps very nice logs when it comes to that kind of information as it's leaving the machine. Like we saw it at normal large amount of data coming from this process, and it's very good. Now the problem is that we're starting to see actors start leverage OneDrive, SharePoint, Azure Data Blobs. Same thing for AWS, which are known platforms where large amounts of data gets moved to. So it kind of like blends in with noise.
Yeah, or they're sending smaller chunks at a time, right? They've been caught enough by sending large amounts of data at once. They learn their lesson. They'll take a little bit more extra time to ship it out in smaller chunks. And right, connected services like OneDrive, like Carlos was saying, it's hard to see when that's strange for your organization.
I have a cricket noise somewhere.
There it is.
There we go.
Yeah. So yeah,
that's what you want the SOC to sound like.
Yeah.
No noise. And then when it makes a noise, that's when you got something to do.
Now, Zach, when it comes to SOCs, one of the things that I've noticed is one specific pattern is that they only do threat hunting in the environment if something hits the news or if they get an alert. I'm not seeing constant threat hunting. I just see them sitting there waiting for some alert to happen or watching news or watching threat intel for something to come in, and somebody asks them, are we vulnerable to this? And then we hunt. I don't see them doing proactive threat hunts.
It's very reactionary usually. And I think the problem is that management or, the business doesn't see the ROI, right? If you have someone who's going to sit there and look for ghosts, what are you going to get out of it? And I actually was setting this up at a place that I used to work at. If you can structure it in such a way where you inform your organization that you're planning to do this threat hunt, right? You're looking for specific activity that you've come up some theory, and your outcome is, successful outcome is nothing's there, right? No one wants to see anything on that report, right? And then that can happen once every so often. Maybe once a month your team can spend resources on doing that. Another problem is inefficiencies in the SOC, right? If you're chasing down a lot of false positives, your alerts are really noisy, then there's no extra time to spend looking for those events. Threat hunting can be super time consuming, right? I mean, it can take a lot of time to sift through all that data, especially when there's nothing very specific that you're looking for that you know where to look. So, a combination of that, all of that, it makes it difficult for a team to really do that proactive stuff, and you're left with reactionary, right? I mean, in the terms of this hit the news, right? The manager sees the threat, they ask for the results. There's a very clear outcome, and they can report success or failure, right? And with no initiator, it's very difficult to see the value. I wish more would do it. I think threat hunting is something that, at least when you reach like a mid to high level of maturity, you should absolutely be doing that in your environment.
I think there's got to be a big knowledge gap, though, because a lot of people have the skills to follow an alert Okay, there's tons of failed login events from this IP address. What is that? What is its host name? Okay, yes, that's one of our machines. It's domain joined. Okay, how long has it been? I mean, you can go through that exercise, I think, as, and be very skilled at it. And I'm not saying the people who do that, don't have great technical ability. Many of them do. But it's hard, I think, to go from there to I'm going to go look for things I don't know. I don't see right now. And I mean, that's not a natural leap to make, I don't think. So you have to be probably kind of primed to do that threat hunting, have some of that background and education and training there to do that. Right?
I would say as a threat hunter or someone who's going to perform a threat hunt for specific outcomes, you do have to be more knowledgeable, right? There's a certain amount of experience you should have so that you know what you're looking for. But I think for someone who doesn't have that experience, or maybe more junior level person in the SOC, I think it's a great opportunity to learn, right? Because as you're threat hunting, in an environment, the more time you spend in the logs, the more you understand your environment. So if you could give, maybe you're not looking for a nation state actor, maybe you're just looking for where is this application running? Maybe it is a remote access tool, right? That's in your environment. And then your threat hunt is to find it and then find anomalies. And I think without that experience, you could do that, right? There is a very clear goal, and you have, you might not have a host name, but you have a tool name, right? At least you can follow those breadcrumbs, and you're not looking for this more ethereal technique that could encompass many other things. So I think it's a great learning tool if an analyst or whoever could find the time to spend, as well as, a higher skilled individual could look for more advanced techniques.
And I think performing threat hunts, the advantage is that, as you mentioned, you have to be more skilled, have a bit more knowledge, because many times we have customers that come to us and just go like, find bad, and go like, what type of bad? There's many bads. So we need to narrow it down to specific actors. We needed to narrow it down to specific threats that you may have. We might base it on history of pen tests that have happened or prior incidents. But at the same time, going through those exercises, I think that they pay exponentially, because it shows where do you have your data source gaps. And it also shows, for example, I had a customer that had a problem with a segment in his network. And until he didn't have an incident, he did not know that the QRadar agent, as it was chipping all of the data, was doing it via UDP. So the data segment, the event data, was being truncated because it wasn't TCP. But he never had to do a hunt. He went like, oh, we're ingesting the proper EIDs. Awesome. But he never did a threat hunt. If he probably would have done a threat hunt before, he would have found probably that as part of their tuning.
I'm holding back not to mention Geoff's title or phrase, thrunting.
Fronting? Quit trying to make fronting happen, Skyler.
You're the one. And for those of you that aren't aware, you should check out our last episode, which coincidentally was about business email compromise, but we also discussed a little bit of thrunting. So,
And some quishing.
And vaping. God, I love IT. Just a bunch of nerds.
Well, we better wrap it up here. I want to thank our guests for joining us today, and I want to thank you all for listening. Security Noise is a production of Trusted Sec LLC. If your organization has any questions about information security, go to www.trustedsec.com.
Right.
All right.